to John McCain. Voters head to the polls in 24 states tomorrow in what's being dubbed Super Duper Tuesday, the biggest one-day White House nominating contest in history. Hillary Clinton is locked in a dead heat with Barack Obama for the Democratic nomination. On the Republican side, Senator John McCain is ahead in nationwide polls and is considered to be the GOP frontrunner. His lead marks a significant comeback for a campaign that appeared expired just 6 months ago. Matt Welch is editor-in-chief of the libertarian Reason magazine. He's a former editor at the Los Angeles Times. He's written extensively on John McCain and the author of a new book called McCain, The Myth of a Maverick. He joins us now from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks so much for having me, Amy.
It's good to have you with us. Well, why don't we just go back to the beginning with John McCain? He comes out of military royalty, as they say. Give us a background on John McCain's family.
John McCain, his grandfather and father were the second ever father-son four-star admirals in the U.S. Navy. One of the interesting things that I found out in the course of researching my book was that the first ever father-son admirals in the U.S. Navy were my own great-great-grandfather and his son, strangely enough, and they both commanded people named John Sidney McCain. He comes not only on his father's side, obviously, from this military background, but I believe his grandmother's side as well. In one of his many books that he's written, he talks about how, if anything, on his grandmother's side was more martial and war-making than even on his father's side. He's basically participated, some McCains have participated in every military conflict in United States history, except for maybe the first Gulf War. And right now he has two sons who are in the military, including one who's deployed in Iraq, if I have my story straight these days.
In addition to being in Vietnam, his father was also was part of the invasion of the Dominican Republic. Is that right?
He led the invasion of the Dominican Republic. His grandfather, the McCains historically had been in the Army. There was Wild Bill McCain, who was, chasing Mexican bandits along the border. But then his grandfather went into the Navy right as Teddy Roosevelt was building it from a couple of tugboats into the Great White Fleet, and was expanding it greatly and using it as a forward thrust of American power under the influence of Alfred Mayer Thayen, his book of the role of sea power in world history. And it became a sort of model based on British colonialism of how Navy can guarantee the world's, make the world safe for democracy and bring fruits upon the empire who takes it out there. So his grandfather was, he's fighting the Philippine insurrection at the turn of the century, which was a fairly controversial conflict, and then fought in World War II with distinction. And then his father was actually the commander of all U.S. forces in Vietnam for a couple of years there, including when John McCain himself was a prisoner of war. John McCain, being the third generation here with a lot of expectations on him, rebelled against those expectations. He finished near the bottom of his class, 894th out of 899 at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, and he was a real sort of maverick in the kind of Top Gun way, always getting into trouble, sneaking off to drink beer and smoke cigarettes and date strippers, and had a pretty colorful kind of straining at the leash type of life because he knew he didn't really have a choice but to fulfill his sort of family's destiny. And he became a flyboy in the Navy and was involved in one of the worst, and in fact, I think the worst Navy sort of tragedy after World War II, which was the Forrestal fire in Vietnam, which killed 130-plus men. He tumbled off the nose of his airplane as it was sort of exploding on the deck of this aircraft carrier in Vietnam. And then on his, I believe his fifth mission was flying over Vietnam on Hanoi on a bombing run and was shot out of the sky and, of course, became a prisoner of war for 5.5 years, where he, withstood torture with great bravery and distinction. He eventually cracked, like most prisoners of war do, under the duress, and taped some statements, disparaging his country and apologizing for his crimes, but stuck it out and then came back to the U.S. in '73 and became the Navy liaison to the Senate, and eventually started his political career in 1982.
And that political career, he started in Congress?
Started in Congress. He humorously, he had divorced his first wife, married a young woman named Cindy McCain now, but Cindy Hensley, her father owned the exclusive beer distributorship for Budweiser in Maricopa County in Arizona, and so had a lot of money. And he was shopping around basically for a congressional seat. On the day that Congressman John Rhodes announced that he was resigning, or actually even before he announced, but on the day that he decided that he was resigning from his seat, John told Cindy, buy a house in the district. So he kind of moved to Arizona with the explicit idea that he would immediately run for Congress and then use that as a springboard to run for the Senate seat when Barry Goldwater retired in 1986. And what's very little sort of understood, one of many things that's little understood about John McCain, is that from the beginning he was spending crazy amounts of money. He's this champion of campaign finance, but he wildly outspent his opponents in Arizona time and time again, especially at the beginning of his career, with his father-in-law's money, with money from Charles Keating, and money from other people, and built up this political career, and ended up going to the Senate and becoming the Maverick we all know and love.
It's interesting, Matt Welch, looking at the talk show programs yesterday. One of the commentators is Victoria Clark, former Pentagon spokesperson. She was on George Stephanopoulos' show yesterday on ABC, talking about McCain, but they didn't identify her as a former press secretary for John McCain. Is that right, in his early years?
Yeah. I think that's pretty standard fare, regrettably, in Beltway talk shows. Everyone has long, entangled relationships with everybody else, and people just don't really feel like revealing it one way or the other. Getting back to his military history, this is something, again, that is not very well understood. Not only were his parents, father and grandfather, in the military, but his father used to go around giving these lectures about how, the naval gap between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was threatening democracy, how his nickname was Mr. Sea Power. He would recite British colonialist poetry around the dinner table. They were constantly talking about the necessity for just a huge U.S. Navy to guarantee the world's security. That is the background that John McCain was just marinating in from the time he was a child. And for much of that period, whenever his father or grandfather was not out at sea, they were living in Capitol Hill, usually in some Washington, D.C. capacity. So he was sitting around the breakfast table with senators and congressmen from the time he was a kid. There's this big notion that he's a man of the people, which is actually the name of a biography of him, when in fact, down the line, he's been very much an elitist his entire life, for both good and for ill. He's just been surrounded by, top historians, top senators and congressmen, and top military brass. But this tradition that he comes from is incredibly interventionist and expansionist. It's really interesting that in the primaries so far, if you look at the exit polls, among people who voted in the GOP primaries who considered themselves anti-war, anti-the Iraq War, and among voters who considered themselves angry at George Bush, and that's a quote, and among independents, McCain is beating his opponents by 2-1. If you actually look at people who describe themselves as just Republicans, McCain has not yet won a single primary. So he is basically winning the GOP primaries on the back of the anti-war vote, when in fact he would be the most explicitly interventionist president since Teddy Roosevelt, and he certainly makes George Bush look gun-shy by comparison.
And when it comes to the future in Iraq, talk about his comments about being there for 100 years.
Well, this is what's interesting about it. Well, first of all, he has been asked several times, how long are we going to be there? How long do you foresee troops? And he just says, hey, look, how long have we been in Korea? No one complains about that. So we can be there for 50, 100 years. It doesn't matter. What matters is that there's no casualties. But if there's no casualties, then the U.S. people will support it. He doesn't understand the question of why is it that it might be bad that the U.S. troops would be on foreign soil in a semi-hostile area for 100 years. He just doesn't understand the question, which I think is even more revealing than the answer itself. There is no downside from his point of view of the U.S. Basically being the world's policeman. I asked him once at a press conference that he was giving about defense spending. I said, hey, look, we're spending right now 50% of the world's total defense budget. What do you think about that share? Should our share be increasing of the world's defense budget or decreasing or whatever? He says, oh, yeah, it needs to increase a lot. We've got a lot of trouble in Iran and Korea and blah, 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 blah. He does not recognize a downside, a sense of game theory in which, you're the biggest kid on the block and you control everything and take responsibility globally for everything.